Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Prairie Strips for Improved Soil Retention, Water Quality, and Habitat Creation with Tim Youngquist. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us at this webinar today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen. And at the end, Carol will come back on and read those out to Tim. This webinar is being recorded. The link will be shared with all of you tomorrow in an email with any resources mentioned during the presentation and the Q&A section. So to introduce today's speaker, Tim's an agricultural specialist with the STRIPS program at Iowa State University. In this role, he helps farmers throughout the Midwest design and implement in-field buffer strips using native perennial prairie species. He is very knowledgeable in native plant ID and establishment, production agriculture, and on-the-ground farm and natural community stewardship. He grew up on a century farm in Northwest Iowa, which has been continuously farmed by his family since 1871. And on that family corn and soybean operation, he oversees a project to create buffer strips in fields and riparian zones on their land. So without further ado, take it away, Tim.
All right, thanks a lot, Brooke. And thanks everybody for joining us today. As Brooke mentioned, my name is Tim Youngquist, and I'm an agricultural specialist with Iowa State University out of Ames, Iowa. I'd like to give a big thanks to the Missouri Prairie Foundation for hosting this webinar and for inviting me to participate. As Brooke mentioned, I'm an agricultural specialist at Iowa State, and my specialty would be planting prairie. So I basically drive around or travel around the state of Iowa and then the Midwest in general, helping farmers and landowners who are interested in integrating prairie into their corn and soybean operations, design and implement and then maintain the prairie on their property. I'll go over some of the basics of that today. And then I guess kind of starting off, I'd like to just get going with a little bit of a story. So this is let's see if I can. Okay, so here we're looking at the original extent of the tall grass prairie. That star there kind of represents Ames, Iowa, and in central Iowa where I'm located. And you can see we're in this kind of the heart of the tall grass prairie there, and it extends well down into Missouri and then kind of all the way up into Canada and all the way down to Texas. The story I'd like to tell is one of the kind of historic vegetation of Iowa and then the changes that have taken place since the early 1800s. So you can see here on this map, the light yellow color represents the native prairie that was once here. It covered around 80 or 85% of the entire state just about 200 years ago. It was the dominant vegetation, dominant ground cover in Iowa, and it really helped to develop some of the most fertile soil in the world. There was an incredible amount of biodiversity, both in plants and animals, birds, insects, all kinds of wildlife. But in the start of the, I guess it was mid-19th century, John Deere invented the moldboard plow, and kind of the rest is history. So in just really a little over a generation, the majority of that original tallgrass prairie ground cover was converted to row crop agriculture. And this is a picture from Boone, Iowa, kind of central Iowa where I'm at. So flash forward just in about 150 years of production agriculture, basically what we have is just largely a state that is covered with these two crops, corn and soybeans. And that kind of represents this gray area that covers most of the map. And the story is not one of just a simple conversion from prairie perennial species to a row crop annual species. It's really a story of a loss of diversity of types of crop and then an increased intensification of the remaining agricultural enterprises. So this is just a little bit of a map showing 3 different townships from the state of Iowa. You can see they're located in different parts of the state, kind of north central, far eastern, and then south central. And starting in the 1930s, moving up to 2002, basically you see a patchwork quilt at the top where you've got small grains, row crops, hay, grass, forests, farmsteads, things like that. But as time moves on, we've really just converted to largely just these two crops, like I said, the corn and soybeans. And those are only really active in drawing up nutrients and protecting the soil for about 5 months of the year. The rest of the time, this incredibly valuable soil that we have here, because of the tallgrass prairie system that used to be here, is very vulnerable, mostly to rain erosion, but also to some wind erosion as well. And this is a picture I took just last summer from a field here in central Iowa. And for anyone that's ever driven around in middle America, when the corn and soybeans are not really tall, this is a really common sight. Where does all that go? Well, this is a picture of the Mississippi Delta. So you can see we've just got a lot of that soil is just kind of moving down off of our hills where it's really valuable down into the waterways and then eventually out to the Gulf. And it goes beyond just the soil. So we're losing that valuable kind of infrastructure as well, but we're also moving a lot of water off of the landscape. So most of the Midwest has a series of subsurface drainage or tile underneath, and that carries nitrogen. And that also ends up in the same spot. So this is kind of an image showing that same thing, that these nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, are getting into the water, leaching off the land and then moving down to the Gulf of Mexico. So modern agriculture is incredibly productive. These prairie soils that we have here, they're deep, they're rich, they're very, very well suited to growing row crops. And that's part of the reason that the system is formed the way that it has. But there's been some unintended consequences with this. And we're never going to be able to go back to having all prairie all the time. But what we started to think about at Iowa State was, would it be possible to have these acres of conservation and acres of production kind of in the same field? So a team of people based out of Iowa State, but at this point it's extended well beyond Iowa State to include groups like the Missouri Prairie Foundation, folks in Missouri, Nebraska, Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, kind of all around the Midwest. So scientists, agronomists, engineers, natural resource professionals, a lot of different folks looking at various aspects of what happens when you put prairie out into the landscape, particularly corn and soybean row crop fields. So why prairie? If you're here in a Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, you're probably familiar with the benefits of prairie, but for one, it's perennial, which means that it's just comes back from the roots. It lives year round. It has deep roots. They penetrate deep into the soil and help transfer nutrients around. It has stiff stems. The stems are a lot bigger than what you see with, up here in Iowa, a lot of our waterways and ditches and things like that are seeded to a grass called smooth brome, which is fairly small and frail, and even in a 2 or 3 inch rain event, it has a tendency to tip over and convey water, where prairie stands upright against that flow of water and makes it harder for the water to flow. So those stiff stems keep it moving. The diversity of the species can't be undersold. So these are species that are adapted to live through our really harsh cold winters and our really hot and dry summers, and they provide an abundant amount of food and cover for insects, for birds, for all different kinds of wildlife. And like I said, it's native. So this all started, the original idea was back in about 2004 at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, which is located near Prairie City, Iowa. It's actually the largest prairie reconstruction in the United States. They have a small amount of agricultural land where they farm corn and soybeans. And on those small agricultural catchments, what the Strips team did was installed prairie in a variety of different ways, and then heavily instrumented those watersheds with all kinds of scientific monitoring equipment. The 4 treatments that we had, so basically you had 100% corn and soybean. That was kind of one of the control that we had. There was one where it was 10% prairie, all at the bottom of the field or the toe slope. One where there was 10% at the bottom and then in contour strip. So kind of what you're looking at, the picture here in front of us, you can see, or on the screen, where there's a little bit of prairie down at the bottom of the hill, and then there's a couple contour strips almost laid out like a terrace. And then we tried 20% of the field in the buffer at the bottom and then in the contour strips. And that little white thing that you see in the middle is what's called a hydrologic flume. Here's a zoomed in picture of that. And essentially that's a funnel. All of the surface water that lands on this small micro watershed or this catchment is going to drain to this common point. And that allows the engineering team at Iowa State to monitor water quality, the amount of nutrients that are moving in that water, the amount of just overall water, and then the amount of sediment that's being carried. And these were instrumented on all these different treatments. So what did we find? Well, starting out pretty quickly, you could tell that there was a difference between having just a little bit of prairie in the field and having no prairie. So keeping in mind that this is managed as a no-till system, which means there is no tillage. The crop is planted, it's sprayed, it's harvested, that's it. There's no disturbance to the ground whatsoever. And this picture that's on the left that I'm showing is on our control field, which is 100% row crop, again, managed the same as all the other fields with the prairie in them. In one 4-inch rain event, this is the kind of runoff that we had coming off of this field. By contrast, the same rain event, one of our other control fields was 100% prairie. You can see the water coming out of the tip of the flume was clear. There's no sediment at all. Then looking at a field that had 10% of that catchment or watershed in prairie and then 90% in row crop. Again, 10% is still a significant amount of that field, but you can see a disproportionate benefit to the amount of soil that's coming out of there compared to the 100% row crop system. You still have some movement. It's not completely preventing the erosion, but it's really keeping that soil in the field and preventing the export from the edge of the field. So again, this was, the idea was kind of hatched in 2004. The plots were seeded in 2007. So at this point, we have over a decade of pretty robust research that we've been doing on a variety of different topics. And these are kind of the highlights. And all this stuff is available on the Strips websites. And these have been basically put out there through peer-reviewed scientific publications. What we've seen by adding 10% converting 10% of a field from row crop to prairie, you're going to see a reduction in the overall amount of water leaving the field. A lot of that's going to be absorbed by the plant material in the spring. So you've got all that thatch and that's going to absorb a lot of the snow melt and just result in like less overall water running off. A 95% reduction in the amount of sediment moving. So you still have some sediment moving. It's not going to completely prevent erosion, but a massive decrease. And then you have large reductions in the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, and then a reduction in the amount of subsurface nitrogen that's flowing through shallow groundwater. In addition to the benefits that you see to nutrient and soil movement, we also saw a really good benefit. So triple the amount of pollinators and double the bird abundance. So really good benefits for wildlife. We didn't see any detrimental effects or beneficial effects to the row crop acres next to it. So you're losing production from the land that's being taken out of production, but the prairie that's there is having no negative effect on the row crop on either side of that. We didn't see any additional weed problems from putting these prairie strips out there. You know, people worry that, well, I'm going to be inviting a lot more weeds. And what we saw was there was kind of the same weeds that were in the fields prior to the prairie being installed were the same weeds that were out there afterwards. A lot of these prairie species are pretty small seeded, and in an environment where you're doing either tillage or herbicide application, it's going to be difficult for that prairie to migrate out into the row crop. And then in terms of just as a conservation practice, very comparable to the cost of putting cover crops on a field and much cheaper than installing a terrace. So during the first probably 6 or 8 years that we were doing research at the Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge and going out and giving presentations like these, more and more farmers and landowners would approach us at these meetings and say, well, if this is such a good thing, can I do it on my property? And that was kind of where I came into the picture. And we moved to what we called Strips 2, where this moved to private farms beyond the National Wildlife Refuge. And kind of where we're at now, not quite up to date. This is about 6 months old, but about 75 or so people that we have worked with personally that have installed a little under 700 acres of prairie strips, and that would be protecting a little about 6,500 acres of cropland. Added to that, one of the big victories that we had was we were able to get Prairie Strips into the 2018 Farm Bill, and now Prairie Strips is part of the Conservation Reserve Program, or what's known as CRP, for those that are familiar with farming. Let's see. So yeah, this is put into the Conservation Reserve Program, and this basically means that for putting Prairie Strips onto your property, you can receive an annual rental payment as well as receiving a payment to cover somewhere between, depending upon the site, 50 to 100% of your installation costs. So if you're a landowner, the payment for the CRP is going to be very, very close or even exceed the payment that you're getting from your tenant for rent. Or if you're a farmer, you could enroll acres that are maybe a little bit less productive, steep hills, maybe something that's adjacent to trees that's going to be getting kind of shaded out. And these could be around the portions or all of the edge of a field, or they could be kind of through the field on a contour. They could be adjacent to a terrace. They can lay out in a lot of ways and be pretty flexible. We can kind of get into some of the design aspects of that. One thing I guess I would like to show, since we have a little bit of time, I'll jump out of this. I've got a video that was produced by the Sand County Foundation. That's a nonprofit out of Madison, Wisconsin that we've worked with for many years. And they've started doing a Prairie Strips program up there. And what we'd like to, I'd like to show you what a farmer up there that they've been working with has said. So let's see if.
Our farm has been in the family since the late 1870s.
Actually, I forgot to click some of the things. Just a second. Pardon me for the. There we go. I'll click one more thing. All right. If I can find this again. Okay.
And now we farm about 800 acres with my brothers. It was a dairy farm up until about 10 years ago when we made the decision to lighten our load a little bit. So we segued into raising Holstein steers, and then we segued out of that in about 2 years ago. So now we raise crops, mostly alfalfa, soybeans, corn, and a little bit of oats. My grandpa was a fairly active conservationist way back. We have some of the oldest terraces in Wisconsin. They were built with WPA money during the Depression. But contour farming was always something we did here. We understand very clearly that the soil is what gives us an opportunity to have a career. We've been entirely no-till for the last 25 years. No-till has been just one of the basic, greatest decisions we've ever made in terms of our operation. It's just been the perfect fit for us on our rolling acres here. I had done some research with Greg Olson on a different part of our farm, and he just brought up the idea of trying something new out here, and I'm always open to new ideas, and it sounded intriguing. So we started out with 3 Prairie Strips 4 years ago. They turned out really well. I like them for a number of reasons, and we added a 4th one 2 years ago, but they fit into our operation. They fit into our philosophy. They look nice, and they obviously do a job for us. They're all placed on slopes where we had issues with water flowing, and they're doing their job.
In general, based on some information that came out of Iowa State University, they talk about doing 10% of a field in Prairie Strips can get you up to 90% reduction in phosphorus loss. This farm has contours on it, so it was kind of an interesting concept for building this. A contour field is much smaller than your standard field because each individual contour is a field, right? So instead, we moved into a concept of let's look at 10% of the hillside, not the individual field. And then we moved into actually looking at how does it fit the operation. So on the 2 lower strips on the hillside we're on right now, we actually went into moving on the contour because that's the way they work this field. The field behind us actually has a strip that it's a rectangular field, and even though the contour is different, It was ran as a rectangle so that it made it easier for them to work around. And its design in width is actually a little bit bigger than these because Dan wanted to make it so that it fit sprayer widths.
There's no wasted efficiency there in terms of making it fit our equipment. So we have one that literally bisects that field by having 2/3 of the land above it, 1/3 below it. But again, it doesn't impede anything we do from a farming standpoint. And I think one of the things that works here is that these are placed very strategically in terms of the whole slope of the hill. So we have a strip that's maybe intercepting the slope at about 1/3 of its slope, and then one at 2/3 of its slope. So you've got two shots at slowing the water flow down before it hits the flatter bottom land. And one of the benefits of when we did what we did out here was that the area had been a soybean field, so there was no herbicide carryover. So we were able to plant oats and alfalfa around what was going to be the prairie strips. We didn't have to use any herbicides on their borders for the first 4 years now because they've been alfalfa fields. Eventually they'll rotate into cornfields, but I'm pretty good at keeping my sprayer where it belongs. So I don't think we'll put them at risk in the next year or two when we rotate out, but it'll be a consideration.
After we've laid out the strip, as Dan kind of stated, you know, the crop planting season is a little bit prior to the actual prairie planting season. So they will end up planting their crops, you know, around the strip that we've got marked off. That area we'll go in and we'll actually make sure that it doesn't have too much duff or surface cover on it, raking it, you know, cleaning it up, making sure that it actually gets good seed to soil surface contact for the seeder. Then we come in and we seed. Usually that's going to be late May, June. Early July is a little late, but we've done it and it works. If you're using a planting method with a drill, you're good, because that means you're actually putting it down in the soil. You're not going to go too deep. You're going to be less than 1/4 inch deep with this seed because it doesn't like to go deep in the ground. And that's another important factor. Some folks like to pound it a little too deep and then we run into problems. If you broadcast it, you want to roll it to push it into the soil. Because if you lay it just on the soil, wind can blow this stuff away. It's very soft, fluffy seed in a lot of cases. Now, the critical aspect that actually comes out of that is the maintenance those first 2 years. We want to cut it, you know, get in there with a mower and actually cut the whole entire thing at 8 inches the first year, 10 inches the second year, and we're going to cut it 2 to 3 times per year. Because what we're trying to do is at that point, the prairie is growing down first instead of up. We're trying to get rid of all the invasives and other problem things that are going to grow with it. We're not cutting the prairie because it's growing down.
Even though Greg said the plants are growing down, it did kind of bother me a little. I was going out there and cutting off what would have been seed heads on the newer plants, and I was like, I'm not sure that makes much sense to me, but it did in the long term, in that we got the weeds that we did not want to perish. And the prairie was just fine surviving that first year without maturing any seeds.
We are actually causing damage to some of the earlier successional prairie plants, but again, we know that that works, and that's, you know, that's the critical factor is get rid of the weeds and allow the prairie to develop. Usually in year 3 on these things, they just pop up. Suddenly the prairie's there. And Dan can attest to that. That's exactly how it also it's there, you know, and that's what we expect. So those first 2 years are critical to keep that maintenance up.
We generally never use any insecticides, so that's not an issue. We will be careful when we use our herbicide spraying on them, but like I say, I have to spray next to neighbors' lawns, so I'm pretty good at making sure that I have the drift in the right direction and being careful with those sorts of things. I probably spent a half an hour this year on each of these prairie strips, just with a shovel, digging out a few things I didn't want in there. You'll get your random thistle and a burdock, and we found a few wild parsnips, but I don't want to say I'm obsessive, but I just don't like those things being allowed to grow the seeds, so I just spent a little time popping them out of the ground.
And that's kind of an ongoing thing. After year 2, we stop the mowings and we go to spot control. Yeah, like Dan was talking about, exactly that is going out and removing the things we individually we don't want there anymore.
But we have black-eyed Susans in here. This is bergamot. There's bees on it right now. We're getting the grasses to start establishing themselves, but the species that we want growing here are pretty well overtaking the strips now, and they're pretty well self-managing too. This is a good example of the undergrowth here. There's, you know, layers of canopy in this whole thing. There's a lot of grasses that are really just coming into their own this year, and they do start out under a canopy of other things. So that's kind of the fun of watching this evolve, just how the competition and the timing of all of it comes together. You'll see monarchs in here, you'll see cabbage butterflies, native bees, bumblebees, honeybees, a number of smaller insects that I can't name, but we had an entomologist out here a couple of years ago looking, and she was just beside herself with all the species she was seeing in here. It's pretty easy to see. If you walk right in there, the amount of insects is just phenomenal. They find this kind of an oasis, and even things like pheasants and such are finding this to be a good habitat for them too.
As we all know, with the way farming is done now, fence rows are getting pulled out. There just isn't that much natural habitat anymore. And as a beekeeper, I understand that the lushness that the bees used to have 40 years ago when there were pastures and sweet clover and white clover by the acre, and in fact people farmed sweet clover or white clover, you know, for the bees to pollinate, that's just not there anymore. We're trying to put a little bit of that back in this system here, and it's showing up. There's a ton of insects in there, and some of those insects are actually beneficial to our agricultural crops too. We're going to see how that plays out when these move into corn and soybeans beside the pollinator strips. There's some documentation that with a soybean crop, honeybees can increase yield by 3 to 4 bushels, and it wouldn't be just honeybees that do that. These pollinators would do the same thing. So it may be in our, as a farmer's, best interest to have more of those pollinators around too. I've never heard a negative comment about them at all, except for the first year when they were like, did your planter miss a spot? You know, when they were still brown and everything else was greening up about them. But became pretty clear pretty soon in the second year that we had something going on here that was planned and not a, you know, a planting mistake.
They've been ideal. We agreed to hold these for 5 years, but I can pretty much guarantee you they will never leave the farm. They seem to have a very good evolutionary progression, so that as they mature, there'll be different species in here more than there are now, and that's fine. We'll have to, that's part of the interest I have in them, is just seeing how they do evolve over the years. So it's been kind of a fun experiment for us.
All right. So yeah, just a little bit of a different taste there with just getting to see what somebody else other than me is saying about them. That was Dan Stoffel from up in Wisconsin, and the good work that the Sand County Foundation has been doing. So there's more than just the folks with Iowa State that are interested in the prairie strips and doing some of this stuff. With the few minutes that we have left, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about design before we go into questions. It's called Prairie Strips, but really there's a lot of different things that you can do with them. You've got, they can be kind of large blocks of habitat. So if you have an area that's, maybe next to a stand of trees, or it's kind of hard to get the large modern farm equipment in there, that'd be a good spot to potentially turn into prairie, and you can create some good habitat that way. As they mentioned in the video, laying these things out so they work with particularly the planter and the sprayer, that pieces of farm equipment, so you can actually increase the efficiency of a field by not having any wasted passes back and forth. Trying to minimize end rows and minimize some of those short rows. So that way, you can play with the spacing and play with the width of the prairie strip to make that work better. And then classically, just the riparian buffer along the edge of a creek or a drainage ditch that kind of acts as that last line of defense to protect those surface water channels. Again, here you get a good picture of keeping these uniform lanes in between the two prairie strips that we have here. And the more that we can interrupt water flowing down the hill, so that steepness and slope length are going to be the two things that really allow the water to pick up speed. And if we can just kind of slow that down and put speed bumps out there with these stiff-stemmed, diverse, deep-rooted prairie strips, you're really going to do a good job of keeping your soil in place on the hill. Just a little bit with seed selection. So there's kind of a lot of different directions that you can go. And again, these are all things that we've researched both at Iowa State and at University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center. Back in the early 2010s, the pollinator mixes were really, really popular. So that would be basically one species of grass for every 3 species of forbs or flowers. And that's a little bit more of an expensive mix, but it's really high in pollinator resources. So if you're interested in that, that's a good thing. Otherwise, a diversity mix that has a little maybe higher diversity, but it has an even amount of grasses and forbs, it's a little bit cheaper, and you're going to see a really good erosion control, I guess, in that kind of a mix. And then that's going to do a better job with your perennial weed resistance. So things like Canada thistle and that are maybe going to pop up with a little less diversity, or a little, maybe a stand that's heavier in forbs or something like that. You're going to maybe have a little more invasion of your Canada thistle and things like that. And they kind of touched on this on the video, but prairies, it's a low maintenance thing. It's not no maintenance. So in the first couple of years, mowing is really, really critical to get out and just kind of when the species get to about knee height, you want to go out and mow it, to that 4 to 6 inches the first year. And generally that's going to be 2 to 3 mowings a year. It just kind of depends on years. And it rains more, you're probably going to have to mow a little bit more. If it's a little bit of a drier year, you might get away with less mowing. But just the thought being, you want to knock down those annual weeds and prevent them from producing seed, and then just give that prairie as much nutrient, sunlight, and give it as much of a competitive advantage as possible. Here's a picture that I really like. Again, this is from the University of Northern Iowa, but a comparison of plots of gray-headed coneflower, which is an early successional, really common prairie species. You can see when you're mowing, you're just creating seedlings that are a lot more robust. You're giving them a lot more of a chance. You're really getting your money's worth out of the seed mix that you put out there. By not mowing, you're going to have just an incredible amount of growth of the prairie, but more importantly of the non-native annual weeds and perennial weeds. And you're really going to be stranding those prairie seedlings that are going to be small in that first year. You're just stranding them in a forest of shade where they're going to not be able to get the sunlight and the nutrients that they need. Long-term maintenance, going beyond the first couple years, if at all possible, burning should be considered for these prairie strips. It's going to do a really good job of, again, controlling invasive species, promoting the growth of the native species, and then really controlling the woody vegetation. So your mulberries, your willows, some of those things that seem to just kind of take over grassland areas, by burning when those things are small, you're really going to cut down on them, and that'll just help the overall health of your prairie. Keeping in mind these prairie strips are part of the USDA Conservation Reserve Program. Prairie strips have a lot of benefits, and there's a lot of good things that they could potentially add to your farm or your property. You know, a little bit of prairie, any kind of prairie, it helps. It helps wildlife, it helps water infiltration, it helps just a wide variety of things. Even a small amount in the backyard can be beneficial. But in an ag environment, we need more than just prairie. You know, a combination of practices is always going to produce the best results. So we're talking about no-till or bioreactors or planting cover crops or just a variety of practices are what are going to produce the best results. And they can be applied in a variety of ways. So again, these aren't going to work necessarily on every single property. You know, if you were putting this in your lawn, there's some parts of your lawn that it would work better than others. It's the same with a corn or soybean field. There's parts that are going to work better than others. There's some fields that are going to work better than others. But the way that the Conservation Reserve Program is set up with this CP43 Prairie Strips program, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can put that prairie out in the field. And again, multiple conservation practices are always going to produce the best results. We're going to be sending around a bunch of links and resources and things, but just here's a couple quick ones. So our website at Iowa State is just www.prairiestrips.org. That's going to be a good one to connect you to all of those scientific publications. We have a bunch of farmer testimonials, not as nice maybe as that video that you saw, but a lot of just written ones. If you have questions, so prairiestrips@iostate.edu is going to be a great way to connect to me and then connect to all the other scientists and team members on the group. And then we've got a couple of social media deals as well. So we got some Twitter and some Instagram that are available. That's kind of it for the presentation. I guess I was hoping that we'd have some time to cover questions and just kind of get into some of that. So with that said, if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Tim. This is Carol David. I'm Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. And thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And we do have a number of questions. And I'll just go through these as logically as I can. Question, are the grasses sown at the same time as the forbs? So your seed mix for the prairie strips, is everything being sown at the same time?
Yeah, yep. And you know, we talked about this before the meeting, and Carol was like, you should take some. So we could talk about this a lot. You want to talk about prairie, I could really talk a lot. So I had to kind of really rein myself in to only talk for 30 minutes. But Carol was like, hey, maybe take some of those extra slides and put them at the end. So that was a great idea, and I did that. Here's some other research. So it happened to be the first extra slide at the end. You can pretty much seed prairie any time of the year. So I wouldn't seed prairie into snow that's deeper than about 3 or 4 inches, and I wouldn't seed prairie in the driest part of August. But other than that, I would seed prairie any time of the year, and I have. I've seen success. That said, dormant season planting, so you know, anytime kind of after the growing season, you're going to see what we have experienced is that's when you're going to get the highest cover of prairie species. So that'd be seeding your grasses and your forbs at that time. Most of the forbs or flowers, they're temperate wildflowers. They need a period of cold, moist stratification. So they basically need to sit outside during winter, and that's what breaks dormancy and allows those seeds to germinate. So planting in the fall or planting in the dormant season is going to result in more of those forbs expressing themselves. We didn't really see a significant difference in grasses, whether you seed it in the spring or the fall. So if you're trying to get forbs and you're trying to get some of those flowers, I would certainly recommend a dormant seeding, just so your seeds can have that cold, moist stratification period. If you were just worried about the grasses, basically they don't need a stratification period, so you could save them and you could plant them later if you wanted to. But they're a lot cheaper and they're a lot more available than the forbs, so I wouldn't worry about it. I would just seed them at the same time, and that's generally how we do it.
Thanks, Tim. And I will say in Missouri, of course, we're more south than Iowa. We when we do prairie reconstructions, we always are sowing the forbs in the late fall or winter. There is another question here related to seeding, which is a question I had. In terms of CP43, is there a minimum number of species that must be planted? And the question we have here from Greg is how many species of forbs are going into a high diversity mix? So a couple questions. When you talk about high diversity mix, how many species are you talking about? And what is required in terms of species diversity if a person is going to use CP43?
Yep, those are great questions. So in terms of a high diversity mix, what we've seen with the majority of the collaborators that I've worked with, we're looking at somewhere between 30 to 50 species. I mean, generally about 36 species has been kind of the standard. So if you think about, these are prairie reconstructions. It's not a remnant prairie. We're not approaching 200-300 species, really nothing like that. I think we've had a couple that have been in 120 species. I mean, there's really kind of no upper limit. You're really only limited by what's available by the market. So what I would say is just trying to mimic the natural community as much as possible, getting for a high diversity mix, a mix of cool and warm season grasses, getting sedges, getting forbs, and then getting some legumes. Just kind of hitting all those little different plant groups is going to be important, and then just having representatives from each one of those. As far as CP43, I don't know the minimum for what's available, but one of the minimum things is that you have to have something blooming all season long. So that's as simple as a early, middle, and end of the season. You would have to you could do it with 3 forbs and the rest could be species of grass. So they're not requiring a lot, pretty much just so there's floral resources all year long.
Thanks, Tim. And for somebody wanting to enroll in CP43, should they, in Missouri or well, anywhere really, should folks contact their local Farm Service Agency office or their local Natural Resource Conservation Service office? So FSA or NRCS?
Yeah, yep, that's a really great point. So your local USDA service center is going to be the spot to stop, and that's going to have both your NRCS and your FSA are going to be located in those offices in your county. It depends, I guess. You could talk to either one. I would say whoever's more helpful in your county, I would start there and make them kind of kick the ball around amongst themselves. But you could certainly just call your local USDA office, press 1 for the NRCS, press 2 for the FSA, however it works in your county, and just tell somebody that you want prairie strips, and they'll connect you with whoever is most appropriate in your county.
Thanks, Tim. And also, can you speak? I know that there could be a lot of complicating or various factors, but in general, how much does the CP43 program, what percent of the cost does the CP43 program cover for a landowner?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, as with all governmental programs, things can be a little bit murky and things can change somewhat quickly. You're going to have at least a base rate of 50% of your establishment costs are going to be paid for. So 50% of your seed and then all those other associated costs. I just came across a thing on the internet today, actually, that was saying that these prairie strips have been approved as something along the lines of like a climate smart type program. And so now they're covering 100% of those establishment costs. And then the annual rental payment is on top of the establishment money that you would get to help pay for getting these things going. You also receive an annual rental payment. These annual rental payments are based on countywide rental averages in your county, and then also based on whatever the top 3 soil types are on the field where you're enrolling that practice. And I believe kind of nationwide, the rental rate is not to exceed $300. So it's not a fantastic amount of money. Certainly you could make more money farming corn and soybeans outright if you were a farmer, like without a doubt. But if you have an area that is really heavy clay or really, a lot of deer pressure or just whatever it may be, an area that's like kind of suboptimal on your farm, this could be a great way to kind of raise the productivity of the entire farm by taking out some of those lower producing acres. I know it's kind of a convoluted answer, but anyway, somewhere between 50 to 100% of your establishment costs covered, and then kind of in the $200 to $300 per acre range for an annual rental payment, generally for a 10-year contract.
Great, thanks. And so, yes, so if you enroll in CP 43, you need to commit to leaving those strips in for, did you say 10 years?
That's correct. Yep, they're generally a 10-year contract, and I think potentially you could get into a 15-year contract if you wanted. And then at the end of that period, you can choose to either re-enroll or you can take those out. And that's actually, there's a lot of things that I'm not going to have time to get into today, but some of those original strips at Neil Smith, just in the last year, we terminated those strips and we started to grow row crop in some of them, and we're looking at how quickly or how long the microbial community and the soil health and a lot of these different parameters, how long these things stay in the soil kind of after that prairie has been moved.
Thank you. And I noticed that we do have some questions about establishing prairie plantings in general, for example, in your yard. And we will send you some resources tomorrow. We have a great how-to article about prairie reconstructions and prairie plantings, and those are wonderful. I just did want to emphasize that with prairie strips, we really are talking about the benefits to row crop agriculture. But of course, some of the same planting methods are similar. And I did want to underscore what I think it was Mr. Olson said in the video about not being sure not to drill the soil or drill the seeds too deep. Sometimes we find we don't drill them at all, but we do make sure we have a cultipack, just because seed planted too deeply is wasted seed. We have a lot of other questions here. How wide are the strips usually? And I guess maybe you could say in terms of the CP 43 practice and then just in general.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, talking about, some of the home landscaping and the yard stuff, all winter long, I've got a little greenhouse that I've set up in my porch, and I grow prairie plants, and it's like, yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So be happy to answer some of those questions too. But in terms of the width, so I've been doing this since early 2014, and when we started, the prairie strips that we were putting out were about 15 feet wide. When you're going into a row crop field, every 5 feet wider that you make that prairie strip, you're going to really eat up acreage really, really fast. So what I mean by that is you're going to, every little bit that you get wider, you're going to have less land available for producing row crop. That said, 15 feet is just simply not wide enough. We were kind of basing that off of an idea from the what's called the contour grass strip standard, which is another USDA program, and the minimum there was 15 feet. So that was kind of how we arrived at that. And what we do now is I won't install anything that's narrower than 30 feet for an infield strip or an edge of field strip. I think that's going to be kind of the minimum, because the wider that it is, the more beneficial it's going to be for wildlife for certain, and you're going to do a better job filtering flowing water and just giving sediment more of a chance to settle out and all that. In terms of the CP 43 program, it's from 30 to 120 feet wide is what the standard is. So you can go for a minimum of 30 feet wide, and again, that can be all or portions of the edge of the field and then going through the field. And if it's over 5% slope, which isn't a lot of slope, but if it's over 5% slope, you need to stay pretty close to the contour if you're going to move out into the field. Or you can kind of take out chunks if you're going to go off of the contour. So yeah, there would be a good thing to think about if you have steep areas on the edge of the field where your end rows, you're being basically farming up and down the hill, even say if you're doing contour strips and they're contour farming in the rest of the field. But if you're farming up and down the hill on the edge of the field, you could take, say, 80 feet wide or whatever it would be, convert that to prairie, and then you would no longer have to do that 2 passes up and down the hill. You could kind of put your prairie there and then have that as like a headlands where you can kind of turn around on. And the CP 43 practice allows for turning around on the prairie strips or on the prairie, which is generally they don't want you to, drive around on the CRP at all. So that's some flexibility there. And another way that we see a lot of farmers up here in Iowa that are really kind of grasping onto that idea.
Thank you. We have some other questions here. You mentioned about, of course, when you have land in strips, you're not deriving direct economic gain off of your crop from it, but you are deriving other benefits. And perhaps by keeping that sediment in place and nutrients, you might have more productive acres of what crops are in place. But we do have a question from Steve. How did the prairie strips impact the agronomic crop harvest production as far as dollars income? Are there any stats on the agronomic harvest dollars with the 10% strip?
Yeah, so we were talking about, well, I guess we mentioned a little bit about seed mix. Cost, the biggest cost of the prairie strip is going to be the foregone, the opportunity cost that's lost by putting these strips into the field, right? Because you're not, you can recoup a lot of that revenue through the CRP program, but again, you're still, even if you're losing some of that soil, you're still going to make more money just with the row crop production. We have, I don't know what to tell you to Google, but you could go to the Iowa State website or the strips.org website, and you could look at some economic papers that have been written there, and you'd be able to get some exact numbers. And I think that was updated as of like 2018. So not incredibly recent, but there is some of those numbers there. But yeah, just across the board, you're going to make more money just farming corn and soybeans. So that's why I guess, I would encourage you to think about edges of the field. I'd encourage you to think about, wet spots that are, just not as productive. And we have a really great opportunity now with all the production or the precision ag tools that we have, the yield monitor stuff and a lot of these maps where you can see exactly how much you're making and exactly how much you're losing on each part of the field. So, every acre is not going to be equal. And one of the folks that I've worked with up here, they encourage people to think about your field if you broke it into, say, 20 foot by 20 foot grid squares and treated each grid square as a franchise restaurant. Some of those restaurants are going to produce more than others, and you may consider shutting some of them down because they're just costing you money all the time. And that's what a business like that would do. So, you could just target some of the lower producing areas and then increase your return on investment for the whole field.
Thank you. In the example with the farmer in Wisconsin, how many acres did he use for his strips total?
I don't know. I would have to look that up, but generally we're talking, 2 to 5 acres. I mean, pretty small amount. So that's why, across 70 some people, we have less than 700 acres. It's like you're really talking relatively small amounts. So it's definitely not the same as taking an 80 and putting it into prairie, but it's encouraging all the benefits that we're seeing from just having, a small amount of native vegetation out there.
Thank you. And Robert asks, so if your goal is a 10% buffer, are you placing 30-foot strips on a 100-yard spacing?
Yeah, to some degree. It kind of depends. And that's something that Greg Olson mentioned in the video. Maybe not necessarily 10% of a field, but 10% of a micro watershed, or 10% of an area where all the water is flowing to a common point, so that could be a hillside or something along those lines. And I think it depends on slope, but generally with the CP43 practice, I think you're going to be limited to something along the lines of like 120 to 200 feet between the strips.
Thank you. As I understand it, the CP43 practice is limited to corn and soybeans. Is that correct? To strips within corn and soybeans. Is that correct?
I believe so. I don't know. It's a nationwide practice. So, I know that every state has not adopted it yet. The NRCS in each state has not adopted it yet, but I'd imagine for some of the states that are growing, a wider variety of crops, it might be possible to get into, wheat or cotton or something like that.
Oh, I just mentioned it because there was a study in California done, not related to prairie strips, but it was a melon farm, and it was having low production of melon fruits, and it decided this farm created or set aside some habitat with some native flowering plants, which attracted more pollinating insects. Those pollinating insects perform more pollination services for the melons, and their productivity and their dollars, their revenues actually increased, even though their total land and crop production decreased. Now that's different, of course, because melons are, exclusively dependent on insects for pollination. But I mention it just because perhaps a farm might have corn and soybeans and have the prairie strips, but it might also have some wholly insect dependent crops, and those pollinating insects supported by the strips might also be helping those insect pollinated crops. Can you speak to this, Tim? Are you aware of anything, anybody who's mentioned this benefit?
Yeah, that's a question that I get a lot, and that's I'm not a scientist, but I'm here representing people that do science, and they make really sure to keep me on like a leash where I don't start saying things that aren't things that we explicitly uncovered in our research. So that's not something that we've seen as a benefit for corn and soybeans. I've heard some of the same stories. We had an interaction with a vintner, a vineyard owner in Oregon that had kind of done the same thing, where they had taken areas that were in just kind of a mowed buffer and converted them to prairie and seen benefit. So I know that's possible, but I'd caution people against thinking that they're going to see a yield benefit. Certainly with corn and even with soybeans, it's not something that we've encountered so far.
Oh, absolutely. And I didn't mean for corn and soybeans, but I meant on another part of the farm, there might be, a wholly insect pollinated crop. And also, Tim, I am not a scientist either. So I definitely respect that we should not be, we should recognize this as conjecture, absolutely. But regardless, there will be an increase in pollinating insects, whether or not there are other benefits, economic benefits. That remains to be conjecture. Another question on the long-term management. Of course, you mentioned the mowing for the 1 to 2 years. And then in the video we saw, or in your presentation, we saw about burning after established. Can the strips also be hayed? Can that hay be used by wildlife? Can the strips be grazed, or is that not allowed are those practices not allowed in CP 43?
Yeah, so as an alternative, mowing and removing the material through haying, that would be great. I think you would have to certainly talk to your local USDA office. I don't know, there's a period used to be called mid-contract maintenance. So it's kind of at the center of, I think, year 4 to year 6 of a 10-year contract. Now it's called required maintenance. And it may be possible to take a hay cutting during that period, but kind of only during that period. And it maybe could be grazed again during that period, but that would be something that you definitely would want to check with your local USDA office to make sure. Again, if you were just going to do this kind of through a different USDA program that wasn't specifically the CRP, I know there's some more flexibility for kind of working lands and things like that. But yeah, it would be possible from a management perspective to hay, and that would it's close to replicating what you get with a burn if it's not feasible. If you just the location of your prairie, it's not possible to burn.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. If you're using the CP43 practice, be sure to discuss allowable kinds of management and use with the NRCS or FSA representative. Thank you. Another question, could prairie strips double as wildlife corridors, or are they too narrow, or is wildlife undesirable for agriculture?
Yeah, this is great. This is a good audience. We're getting some really good questions here. Yeah, I know that that's something, I think I showed a picture a while back where there was kind of a drainage ditch, and there was kind of a tree planting that had been done in the 1970s, and then there was sort of a small awkward part of the farm. And my goal there was to kind of take that small chunk, turn that into prairie, and then basically use the prairie strips as wildlife travel corridors. So I know that that's something that we certainly have an eye towards that, and connectivity is everything with wildlife. Being able to, if you're close to a county park, state park, something like that, some natural area, just kind of linking these things up so the wildlife have areas to move, and something that's going to be more desirable than a ditch for for nesting and breeding and things like that. So yeah, they could be, and generally I don't want to speak beyond what I know, but if you have an area that there's already a lot of deer predation, the deer are eating your soybeans or whatever it is, the prairie strips are not going to bring more deer. What we've seen kind of in the northeast part of the state where the deer pressure is really heavy is the crop along the edge of the strip will be kind of browsed pretty heavily, but it strangely seems a little bit concentrated to there along the edge of the strip because the deer seem to be using that corridor. I'd say that would be just an area of ongoing research, but there seems to be a lot of potential for wildlife using these as habitat corridors.
Thank you. Another question is about farmers who may have their soybeans in Roundup Ready soybeans, and so they're spraying, the soybeans with the Roundup. How does herbicide use affect the strips, and how can you prevent drift so that herbicides that are used on the crops are not damaging the plants in the strips?
Yeah, read and follow label instructions on the herbicide would be the first thing. I mean, what we see generally with drift is you're going to get to the broadleaf plants, you'll get, maybe some cupping or some curling, and maybe the plant won't bloom. But once it's established, they're harder to kill than just what a little bit of drift is going to do. If your spray boom is directly over the edge of the strip, it's pretty likely a direct hit can hurt some of these things, and you may need to go back and reseed some of those areas. So, watching wind direction, watching your temperature, just not tank mixing anything that shouldn't be mixed, keeping your boom as low to the ground as possible, just kind of following the best management practices that you should be following anyway are going to be the best way to kind of see the greatest success, and not interfere with any herbicide drift or, kind of direct herbicide damage onto the strips. But it's certainly a concern. So yeah, being as conscientious as possible.
Thank you. Question, does the CP43 include the installation costs like equipment rental and labor?
Yes, it does. Yep, and then there's also payments for that require, I guess, no, there used to be payments for the required maintenance, but now they just call it required maintenance. They don't do that. I should have not said that. So there are some other kind of, there are some other payments that are available, but yeah, the establishment cost is beyond just the seed. If you needed to rent a drill or pay someone to do the installation or pay for site prep or any of those things, that is all covered.
Thank you. Another question, are there other incentive programs for installing and maintaining prairie strips besides CP43?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So there's some other programs through the USDA. There's one EQIP, and that would be environmental quality enhancement program, something like that. So that'd be one that you could do, that you could seed prairie, and then it would allow you a little bit more flexibility. So we kind of talked about the ability to graze or kind of some working land stuff, but they have some more flexibility there. There you're getting a one-time payment for establishment and maybe a little bit of an incentive payment, but you don't get the annual payment that you get with the Conservation Reserve Program. Here in Iowa, there's a program through Pheasants Forever that's called Prairie Partners, where essentially if you just agree to, it's either I think a 5-year period to leave the prairie strips, or prairie strips, just prairie in general, you know, prairie in your yard, whatever. And they'll pay for 50% of the seed cost. So there's some stuff you could look around, you know, I think talking to your local USDA, or like there's a lot of really good nonprofits. I mean, folks like the Missouri Prairie Foundation here that we're talking to, otherwise Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever, you know, some of the different organizations that are habitat focused, Trees Forever even, they might be able to help you with small grants or cost share to help get some seed or get some technical advice or something else.
Thank you. And I should have clarified, is CP43 practice, is it only for if you're deriving an income from corn and soybeans? I mean, I guess you might be in a situation where you're planting those for personal consumption, maybe. I mean, is CP43 only for, you know, for-profit farms, I guess, is for income properties?
I guess I know, you know, cities are not eligible. I'm not sure about nonprofits. But yeah, there would have to be a cropping history on the property, and then yeah, again, I guess I would say talk to the local USDA office about that.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. Sericea lespedeza is a continuing problem that we have in pastures and in other areas in Missouri. And Cheryl's asking the question, she envisions it invading prairie strips. Can you describe a safe and effective method to eradicate it from the strips?
First thing would be just scouting. You know, just the more that you're out there looking, the less you're going to get out there and find out that half of the strips have been invaded by, yeah, lespedeza or just anything else. So just going out and checking routinely. I mean, some type of chemical control is probably going to be the best thing. And again, just scouting it and finding it early and getting on top of it, and then repeated treatment. I don't have any magic recipes, but again, just like finding it before it's become a large problem is going to be the biggest key.
Thank you. Just a few more questions here. Have the results of the strip study been written up into an Iowa extension guide?
Yeah, there are, so the Iowa Learning Farms would be one that you could look at. I think last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, they produced kind of a decision tree for just general, it was a general conservation practices manual. And it was kind of like, well, if you're interested in this, and then it would sort of guide you along and turn to page whatever. So the Iowa Learning Farms, and you could look at that, and there is some information there. Otherwise, our website, prairiestrips.org, we have a pretty comprehensive frequently asked questions page, and just a lot of, you know, PDFs and handouts and things that we've made over the years. So there is some of that exists.
Great, thank you. Have you tried this on roadsides and or ditches, and did it work? And also, so that's the first part of the question. Have you tried it on roadsides and or ditches, and did it work?
Yeah, we didn't, but so that's a really neat thing that the state of Iowa does, and it started, I believe, back in the late 80s or the 90s. My colleagues at the University of Northern Iowa are going to be upset. I don't remember exactly when that was, but there's it's called the Integrated Roadside Vegetation Management Program, and there's something on the order of, I think, 700,000 acres of roadside in Iowa. It's not like Missouri, you know, we've got a road pretty much every mile in every direction, no matter what. So a lot of roadside, a lot of ditches, and we've started a comprehensive program to convert those to prairie. And yeah, I'd say it's worked pretty well. I don't know a lot about it, but that'd be something, I don't know hard numbers, I guess, but that'd be something to look at the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center and their roadside vegetation management program. But if you drive around in Iowa, you know, you'll see a lot of prairie. And again, these are reconstructions, you know, there's not, you know, not the same as like a remnant community, but again, just much the same concept. You know, you're getting a lot of, you know, your butterfly milkweed, your Culver's root. I mean, some really nice showy species along the edge of the road where previously they were planted to smooth brome or some low diversity planting.
Thank you. And the second part of the question is, how do the highway crews react? And I think the answer is there's a very strong native roadside, vegetation program in Iowa.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it varies. I mean, just anecdotally, I mean, certainly you hear about, things that get mowed and they shouldn't have been mowed. But how it works is each county has their own roadside manager, which is going to be a full-time position. And I know Johnson County, Iowa, that's where the University of Iowa is at. They produced a really cool video. Maybe I can connect Carol with that, but just basically saying, we seeded X number of acres of roadside to prairie and we saved X $1,000 per year. So it's something that, again, it takes it seems like a funky idea, this planting prairie in the middle of a crop field or planting prairie in a ditch or whatever, but it's really, when it catches on, it can be a wonderful thing, and it can really produce a lot of benefits.
Thank you. Do you have time for just a couple more questions?
I'm here if you are. Yeah, I'm having fun.
Okay, great. And I did want to mention, so for anyone who's in Missouri, we have another recorded webinar about the Adopt a Highway program in Missouri, and how you can go about adopting a mile or more of highway in Missouri, not just for litter control, but also to plant native plants. So if you're interested in that, you might want to watch that webinar. You can go to the MoDOT website. And you can also, when you see native vegetation and prairie plantings on roadsides in Missouri, do let MoDOT know how much you appreciate that. It's really important for them to hear feedback. Or if you don't see it, you might stress how pleased you would be to see prairie plantings along MoDOT right-of-ways. They do have a lot of ground to manage, but they do definitely respond to feedback. So I'm kind of getting to some of the questions that pertain more to plantings on properties. And there's a question about places to suggest to buy the best / genuine seed. And Tim, I would like to answer that, if I may, for Missouri, the lower Midwest. If you go to the Grow Native website, grownative.org, you can find Grow Native professional members who sell native seed, and you can look under so just go to grownative.org, resource guide, and then click on seed. And that's for the lower Midwest. In terms of Iowa, and for anyone tuning in from Iowa, would you like to respond to that, Tim?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on the, again, the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center, and this will be included in the material that Carol will send out after the meeting. They've got a list of just service providers. So that would go kind of Iowa and beyond. I think, we're looking at some from Missouri, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, just surrounding areas. But, who does burning, who sells seed, who can do plantings, things like that. They've got a list of technical service providers on their website, and contact information, and website, all that stuff.
Great. And Anna has not a question, but a really interesting story. She says she's a 3/4 acre suburban yard on a hillside and a wild creek running under the yard and a pipe. I have layered several strips against the hillside and planted or allowed native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers to grow in these strips. And I know that stormwater is significantly slowed by this effort. We also had waterproofing done on an 80-foot strip along the front of the house. They used the soil from that waterproofing to be bermed along the lowest part of the yard above the underground creek, creating a large rain garden. I planted appropriate native plants in the rain garden, and so far have allowed native redbuds and other shrubs to grow. When stormwater flows into this area, it fills about a foot deep before soaking into the ground a few hours later. And one last question: can a prairie strip be grown on residential land or a home garden of, say, 1/2 acre? Please mention briefly how to go about it. And also thanks for the awesome presentation. I don't know if you'd like to provide some brief tips on how to go about this, Tim?
Yeah, and that's a really neat story. Just about the native plants in the side yard and the rain garden and all that. I mean, it's just it's neat. It's really, really neat. It's something that I really enjoy. My whole yard is planted to natives, and I'm sure it's just great. I guess I'm just kind of muttering. In terms of planting prairie, I would, maybe talk to somebody that has some expertise. I'm not going to be able to give you all the ins and outs right here. I mean, site prep is really critical. So whatever vegetation is there right now, make sure that that's terminated. So whether you want to do that through, chemical control, and if you don't want to do that, well then using so just something to smother it, just to make sure that whatever's there is gone when you get started, and then doing a fall seeding. So just take whatever local native ecotype high diversity seed that you can get, and hand broadcasting that. I'd say do it sometime, down there, I guess, I don't know, we always say up here kind of mid-November after. So certainly after that for you guys, maybe even 1st of January, something along those lines. Hand broadcast, you can just throw the seed out, the rain and the snow and everything, the freeze thaw will get the seed kind of into the perfect layer. And then the next year when things start to grow, just kind of mow it repeatedly. You can't mow it too much. Just kind of make sure you keep the weeds under control. And then the next year, again, just mow it a couple times in that second season. And by the third year, you should have some prairie, and just kind of spot control from there on out. So hand pulling weeds or cutting off seed heads, just that. But I know there's a lot to it. I think I seeded my first prairie. I was back probably 2008, 2009, and like it totally failed. So there's a lot of ins and outs to it. So I'd connect to someone that knows what they're doing a little bit for your first time around. There's a lot of resources. I'm sure, like Carol mentioned, the Missouri Prairie Foundation has a good handout with some of those basic information. There's a lot of resources available online and elsewhere. I don't know if we have more questions or not, but we were talking a little bit about those cantaloupes or the melons that we were growing, and are there benefits to other spots on the farm? Well, it's like I'm not insect pollinated, but like humans live on the farm, and again and again the coolest part of my job is driving around or just meeting with different farmers and landowners all over the state and the Midwest. And now that we've been doing this for several years, hearing, well, my granddaughter had her senior pictures taken in the Prairie Strips, or well, every night in the summer after supper, my wife and I, we go for a walk out there in the prairie. The Prairie Strips, it's my favorite part of the farm. It's something that it goes beyond the economics. It goes beyond the benefits to the insects. It goes beyond the benefits to soil health, water quality, all those things. I mean, it's beautiful, and it's our natural history. That map that I showed at the beginning, we're in the heart of the Tallgrass Prairie Center or Tallgrass Prairie region, and mountains and oceans and some of those things get a lot of credit, but really prairie is just as dramatic and as beautiful as either one of those things. And it's something that it should be celebrated. And I think it's really enchanting. So if you get a chance to go and visit a prairie, you get a chance to seed some prairie on your own, I think it's something that it can be really captivating and just benefit you more than just your property. So that's about my closing words, I think.
Those are wonderful closing words. Prairie is indeed enchanting and captivating. I love those words that you used. I did place in the chat 2 resources that the Prairie Foundation has on establishing prairie plantings. We have a webinar and a guide, and we'll make sure to send those out in an email tomorrow. If any of you are available on Saturday, you can come and join us for a dedication of an original unplowed prairie in Southwest Missouri. You can go on our website for more information on that. And as Tim said, prairie plantings are extremely rewarding on farms or in your backyard, roadsides, lots of places. Tim, thank you so much for this very informative presentation. And thanks everyone for tuning in and for your very insightful questions. And do watch for the email tomorrow. And we have more webinars coming up this summer and then on into the fall. So Tim, thank you again very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.